Hello everybody, and welcome to part 21 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review series. Today we are continuing our Knights of the Old Republic comic journey with Volume 3, which is Days of Hate and Nights of Anger, where we're going to see Zane and his friends confront some old enemies, but mostly some new and interesting ones. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive straight into it. Our story begins with issue 13, with a brief glimpse at a mysterious Duro character hooked up to an interface where he's monitoring many different individuals. He eventually settles on a recorded image of Camper from Zane and the crew's misadventure on Telerath, and he calls somebody named Lord Adaska, telling him that he has what they've been looking for. Elsewhere on the world of Raltir, Zane and Jarael spar with lightsaber and shockstaff. When Jarael takes Zane's saber, he blocks a glancing blow with his vambraces, armbands made by Camper, which are made from lightsaber-resistant tyridium and fricite. The vambraces are a parting gift, however, as Camper's health is getting worse and Jarael wants to find a quiet place for them to slow down on their own. Plus, she argues it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to all hide from their different pursuers in the same place, especially with Griff around. Though he wishes that Jarael had stuck around, she goes off with Camper and Zane meets back with Griff, who hopes to get a good deal on a ship for the two of them, as the populace of Raltir has become more paranoid, with the Republic amassing their war fleet around the planet. That night, as Jarael and Camper leave the planet with a mysterious glowing red box on board, a Trandoshan named Slisk arrives to sell a ship to Zane and Griff, but he reneges on their deal as he believes that Griff can pay him far more. Zane and Griff quickly arrange a little accident on the platform so Griff can save Slisk's life, meaning that he owes Griff a Trandoshan life debt. Griff gets more than he bargained for, however, when Slisk asserts that not only do they get the ship, but he is indebted to their service for life. The three exit atmosphere and approach the Republic fleet before realizing that their ship, christened the Little Bivoli, is a mess. Literally, the ship is a provisions ship for the military, and the Republic officers demand that they join them on the front lines. Elsewhere, as the last resort travels through hyperspace, Jarael and Camper are ambushed by an HK-24 assassin droid, who identifies Camper as an Arcanian offshoot and says that it's his objective to capture him. Continuing to issue 14, LB comes to the rescue and distracts HK-24 before Jarael attacks the droid with chains. HK-24 appears to gain the upper hand, however, before Rollo comes out of nowhere and blasts the droid to pieces. Hey, so this is me while I'm editing. I just now realized this character's name is Roland, not Rollo. I don't know how I got that wrong all through the script of both this video and the last one. That's just not his name. His name is spelled differently and it has an N on the end, so I'm going to make that mistake for the rest of this video. I'm not about to re-record all of the audio, and I'll make sure to fix it next time. Thanks. Rollo explains that he hid aboard the Last Resort since the Flashpoint incident to try and find a place to shed his armor and start anew, but none of the worlds that the crew had visited suited him, so he stayed hidden. Out on the Mandalorian front on the planet Serroco, Zane, Griff, and Slisk have set up their mess ship to profit from the Republic soldiers as legitimately as they can appear. Zane takes a break to have lunch with a Republic lieutenant named Carth Onasi, who explains that he was once stationed on the planet and used to call in fake tornado warnings for the alien Stareb natives to stave off boredom, but explains that it wasn't as fun once he actually met the Starebs. Zane notices a Stareb searching the trash for food and helps him to a free meal, as Carth explains that the Mandalorians will be attacking the planet tomorrow. After paying for all three of their meals, he leaves to get back to work. That night, disillusioned with Griff's constant scams, Zane takes a walk about the city. Sitting in the street, he has an overwhelming force vision of the Mandalorians arriving at the next sunset to destroy the planet. Zane convinces Griff to start packing up shop and goes to speak to Republic Admiral Karath. Moving on to issue 15, Zane sneaks aboard Carth Onasi's ship to tell him about his vision. Carth thinks he's crazy at first, but becomes convinced Zane is a Jedi after he force snatches his gun from him. Griff decides it's time to finally haul it out of Serroco before the Mandies arrive, but doesn't want to miss out on the profits he might make serving Slisk's delicious Trandoshan hotcakes during the breakfast rush. Later, Griff gets a call from Zane to leave ASAP, but decides to stick around to make even more profit by serving lunch. When the soldiers finally desert after having been served seconds, Griff decides it is finally time to leave, but Slisk lets him know that the Little Bivoli is fresh out of fuel and they won't even make it to orbit, as alarms begin to sound. In orbit, Carth brings Zane to the Admiral, who immediately recognizes him as Zane Carrick, alleged Padawan murderer, which honestly, I'm kinda surprised nobody else had recognized him him sooner. Furthermore, the Admiral accuses him of being a Mandalorian sleeper agent, piecing together all of Zane's actions, convinced that he's been leading operations against the Republic on Taris and Vanquo, and has finally come to deceive them with claims of a vision. Which, gotta admit, if I were in the Admiral's shoes, the evidence would look pretty damning. These comics have done a lot to pit the Republic and the Jedi as corrupt or incompetent, but Karath isn't exactly wrong to be suspicious of Zane, given what he knows. Zane tells him that if they won't listen to him, then to call his Jedi friend Squint, as he and his master have also been investigating Jedi visions related to the war. The Admiral orders Karth to call the Jedi either to clear Zane or give him up, and they're amused and suspicious that Zane doesn't even know Squint's real name. Just then, the Mandalorian fleet emerges from hyperspace inside the system and launches nuclear warheads. The Republic fortifies their defenses, but the missiles go straight past the fleet and onto the planet's surface, where they wipe multiple Starab and Republic settlements clean away, and the little Bivoli seems to have been destroyed in the attack. The Jedi spread across the galaxy feel the attack through the Force, including Squint and his master, as well as the Jedi Covenant. Karth visits Zane in his cell and tells him that he called in false storm alarms on 17 Starab cities in the hopes that some of them might have found safety in their underground catacombs, and tells Zane to hang in there. Beginning the Knights of Anger arc with issue 17, we see a Force vision from Master Rana Tay, where she's witnessing Zane and the 4 other Padawans wielding red sabers and standing over their own smoldering spacesuits, a dark parallel to the scene that Zane walked in on a long time ago. Zane tells her that this is actually his own vision, reminding her that the one who confesses the Covenant's crime to the Council will be the only one to survive Zane's revenge, and demands that she open her eyes. When Master Rana Tay wakes, she determines that the only way to stop these night terrors is to kill Zane and the white-haired woman who saved him. Basically on cue, we cut to Jerael as she lands on Arcania, a chilly world that boasts advanced bioengineering facilities and is ruled by Lord Adaska. Local authorities recognize her as an Arcanian offshoot and force her onto a segregated transport to the city's medical facility. Flashing back, we see Jerael and Rollo stabilizing Camper's medical condition on the last resort, but Rollo insists that he be cared for by somebody familiar with Arcanian physiology. Though Jerael knows that Camper has been running from Arcania for decades, they head that way in order to save his life. Back in the present, Jerael is being shown the way of Arcanian life by a local named Zadawi. She explains that Arcanian offshoots were bred by Arcanian purebloods to be superior miners, but after the mines ran dry, they became discriminated against and were only allowed to live in certain desolate areas. Though Zadawi's grandmother is apologetic to their oppressors, Zadawi is always looking to get one up on the purebreds and agrees to help Jerael disguise herself to get Camper the help he needs. Jerael's attempt to bribe a medical officer fails, but she is taken in by Lord Adaska. His flagship, the Arcanian Legacy, hails the last resort with Jerael aboard, and Camper, seeing Adaska and Jerael together, collapses. Moving on to issue 17, as Camper is taken into quarantine, Adaska explains to Jerael the history of his company and Camper's involvement in it. We find out that Camper in his youth was a brilliant scientist named Gorman Van Drake, but due to his offsuit genetics, was susceptible to a deadly pathogen known as Balanquoir's virus, which lies dormant until symptoms arise in old age. Though Jerael is heartbroken at the thought of leaving Camper with the people that he fears the most, Adaska assures her that they are indebted to him, and invites her to stay and assume her natural appearance again while they wait for Camper's recovery. Across the galaxy at Serroco, the Republic fleet is getting hammered by Mandalorian Neo-Crusader shock troops. The Admiral, Karth, and the others aboard the ship are overwhelmed and fall back to the brig for a final stand. They find Zane there and agree to let him help them fight, but he reveals that he's been slowly removing the screws on the back of his wall panel with the Force by meditating for several days. On the Arcanian Legacy, Rollo, who was with Jerael but imprisoned by the Arcanians, is questioned, and it's revealed that Rollo was presumed dead by the Mandalorians and became a sort of folk hero, Rollo the Questioner. As a gesture of goodwill, the Arcanians let Rollo free to explore the ship. Elsewhere, Adaska's Duro assistant named E.G. updates Jerael on Camper's procedure, explaining that it could take days to revive him. However, when he signs off, we see that Camper is with him and already perfectly well. He deduces that Balanquoir's virus is actually completely made up, and E.G. confirms this by telling him that he simply had an allergy to something that had grown in the ship's vents on Taris. However, E.G. also reveals that they need both Camper and Jerael for something far more sinister. They want Camper to finish whatever it was he was working on before he left the company, and they're holding Jerael hostage to ensure that he does so. Moving on to the 18th and final issue, Master Lucian Dre discusses the plans of his covenant with Hazen, his old mentor, on Telarath, despite the Mandalorians advancing soon on the planet. Hazen tells Lucian that his father's company, the Dre Trust, moved out of Telarath in time for the invasion at the behest of the Covenant's Jedi Seers. Hazen also brings up his mother's old visions, which have influenced their plans for so long, and deducing that since Zane is currently imprisoned on a Republic ship called the Courageous, they know now what she meant when she said in her vision that the Courageous will fall. Gotta love those super vague prophecies. Finally, Hazen lets Lucian know of a coming Darth presence that isn't a Sith, but may interfere with their plans, which is Lord Adaska of Arcania, and sends Lucian to investigate. On the Arcanian legacy, Adaska meets with Jerael, maintaining the facade that Camper is still recovering, even throwing in that Camper's long-held personal paranoia against Adascorp was a result of his condition. He asks her about her heritage because of her unusually pointed ears, where she explains that her childhood doesn't really make sense to her and agrees to discuss it more over dinner. Adaska excuses himself to meet back with EG, where he says that though she's an offshoot, there's something about her that seems very pure-blooded somehow. Adaska goes back to check on Rollo, who has been spending all of his time reading everything he can on battlefield medicine, pharmacology, and genetics. Rollo reveals that he's onto Adaska's ruse with Camper and wants to leave with Jerael. Adaska asks Rollo to contact somebody though in exchange for safe passage anywhere he pleases, showing him a hologram of something that had been locked away in Camper's mind. After seeing this, Rollo becomes convinced and does Adaska's bidding. At their dinner, Adaska tells Jerael about his plan to restore the true Arcanian race. He doesn't blame the Arcanian offshoots for existing, but views their continued existence as a symptom of a race that has corrupted itself. He believes that for some reason, Jerael's blood could be the first step in strengthening future Arcanian bloodlines. He then reveals to her that Arcania has secured a wild but dormant group of exogorths, enormous spacefaring, metal-eating worms around the dying star of the Omanoth system. He finally reveals why Camper is so important, because he discovered how to control the minds of exogorths and use them as weapons. With this information, we can finally see Adaska's plan, to sell the unstoppable exogorths to the highest bidder and give whoever buys them an upper hand in the war. So overall, this was another really good comic volume that had a very captivating set of mysteries that it set up for itself to kind of watch unfold. I really liked how the backgrounds of Jerael and Camper are tied to the ongoing conflict with the Republic and the Mandalorians. I was kind of hoping and expecting that would be the case, but it's also like they've already been established as their own characters, and they want to break away from their past and kind of be defined on their own terms, kind of a little bit like how Zane is. And it's interesting to kind of see their own like already self-determined identities and lives that they've already defined for themselves come to clash with their pasts and the prejudices of this homeworld that they came from that tries to reduce them into something else. That's one theme that I really feel like Star Wars does really well overall, especially kind of newer Disney Star Wars stuff like the sequel trilogy. What I think they do really well is that this message that your past, whether that be like your past allegiances or your homeworld or your bloodline, you know, something like that might come back to haunt you. And while you always have this chance to define yourself on your own terms, it's always interesting to see what happens when in a story you actually have to confront that past and kind of reckon with it again, what that means in terms of your identity, and kind of use that experience to then build on your identity more. Again, it feels like we're kind of halfway through this story of Arcania and Adaska and Jerael and Camper, so I hope kind of those themes end up solidifying into what I hope they are. But overall, Jerael and Camper are proving to me more interesting than I was kind of thinking they were at first, which is nice. Zane and Griff have definitely stolen the spotlight for a while in terms of character work, and I'm really happy to see them act more consistent as characters for a bit and kind of not see them go through any dramatic character arcs, so that we can start seeing that for Camper and Jerael. You know, every character deserves their time to grow and be tested and adapt, and sometimes you can't do that for all of the characters at once, especially when you have a set of characters that are so different. Yeah, basically right now Zane is mostly just trying to be a good Jedi and really altruistic, and while that wasn't really the focus of his character maybe before, it makes perfect sense that in this kind of setting where the Jedi establishment is either actively trying to kill him or is complacent in it, it makes sense that Zane, although he is kind of like a non-traditional Jedi character, would be the one who is most worried about saving innocent lives. and that, like, again, it's not something we've necessarily seen too much from Zane, but it feels perfectly in character for him to be so worried and so distraught, not only for his friends, but just like the innocent aliens on a planet. But other than that, and especially Griff doing his usual, which is risking his life for profit, they aren't really growing or changing as much, which I think is good and kind of what I need right now for the two of them, because we can't just go going arc after arc putting Zane through the ringer if we want to focus on these other characters. I thought the twist of having Camper be the one behind this like super secret Exogorth super weapon project to be pretty cool. You know, I never really had a good guess, or I guess there was never really any hard evidence for exactly what the mystery was behind Camper and what he was running from. You know, while I don't think this is maybe like the most interesting reveal possible, because it kind of came out of left field because there weren't really any clues beforehand, it does tie Camper into the overarching conflict in a pretty interesting way. Lore-wise, the idea that these Exogorths or space worms, which we first saw in The Empire Strikes Back, are these like super ancient creatures that were at one point used as these huge super weapons in an ancient war is pretty fun. I think Star Wars sometimes has a problem of like overstepping its boundaries when it comes to explaining certain minor elements from the films, or perhaps overindulging in the origins or other details of like certain iconic background characters or creatures. But I think this inhabits a very fun middle zone, and it kind of makes the world feel bigger that each and every one of these elements that we see in the original films has some bizarre other story behind it that we could have never known or guessed. It's like a very nice middle zone, I think, of self-referentiality. Knowing that Zane Carrick and the Space Slug from Episode 5 are related, I think honestly enhance my overall Star Wars experience, and this is one of the main benefits I feel like I'm getting from doing it in chronological order. I'm not too sure how I feel about the idea of like Camper's mental condition just being perfectly healed and his mind returning to like his defiant young former self, because in real life, you know, I've seen real people, family members, decline mentally and in their old age, and, you know, having their minds slow down. So for there to be like this magical or scientific like fix to that kind of ailment in like a fantasy or sci-fi story, I don't really find that very compelling. It kind of takes me out for a bit because it doesn't feel very realistic. You know, when the characters have to grapple with their declining loved ones, like cognitive abilities, and maybe learn how to enjoy their time with them in maybe new but maybe more limited ways, you know, those are stories that I would find really compelling. And I thought that maybe Jarael and Camper might end up having to go through that. But this is far from the end of the story, so I don't know exactly if Camper's condition is going to be permanent, how exactly he's going to deal with the Exogorths, if he's going to maybe like sacrifice himself for everyone's safety. But the fact that he just magically returned to normal, you know, if I could snap, I would snap. You know, I don't know. I just found that kind of disappointing because I don't feel like a story where you have an aging elderly family member that magically gets better. I don't know if that's a story that really like teaches you anything or helps you out in any way, but if it's just a plot device for us to get some cool story about a bunch of giant space worms, then, you know, I guess it's okay in the long run. As for Jarael, I wish we had gotten a little bit more from her, honestly. It feels like for this story, she's mostly just there to sit around and be manipulated by Adaska and wear revealing clothing. Even at the beginning of the story arc, and especially earlier in the series, I thought we were seeing hints that she might want to learn more about the Jedi way, or at least an unconventional version of it from Zane, at the very least in terms of combat. And I'm a little disappointed that for the moment she seems to have been reduced to a kind of bargaining chip to be shuffled around by all the other characters. She's important, but we don't know why it's important, and we're kind of getting drip-fed this information, which is fine, but it's just, you know, when you have a female character that's important and you don't know why they're important, and they just have to sit around and be sad. I don't know. I had this idea of how they were building Jarael up, and now it just seems like when she's finally getting really important for the plot, they're kind of reducing her in a way. You know, I don't blame her for being put in a tough spot and for worrying about Camper and not really knowing what to do in this situation. I just kind of struggle to believe that she would be as naive as she is in this, and I don't know. I just feel like the plot for this particular couple of arcs really isn't doing her any favors, at least in my eyes. In terms of antagonists, I think that Adaska is pretty solid. All things considered, he isn't too much more than just your stock mustache-twirling, manipulative, capitalist eugenicist villain. You know, I feel like the other villains we've gotten in this comic so far are marginally better than the average Star Wars villain. I think Lucian's pretty interesting. But, you know, I think that, like, his grand plans for the Arcanian race are messed up and creepy, you know, paired with his corporate greed. You know, always great primary or secondary motivations for a villain, especially a Star Wars villain. So I think the combination of everything that he's up to is great for a good, like, temporary villain. And again, with the Exogorths, it's always just good to see and more interesting to see, like, more wrenches being thrown into this Jedi-Mandalorian conflict to keep things fresh and weird and unexpected, and that good Star Wars brand of pulpy, where just some ridiculous over-the-top thing can be pulled out of the ass for the story, which honestly is something I like, even though I know that's not something that some other people may like. I'm definitely feeling that there is a lot more to Hazen than is being lit on here. He wasn't exactly super prevalent in this story. It feels like we are going to find out more of what he's up to in the next volume. You know, overall, the plans of the Covenant and everything have been taking a back seat in terms for this Arcania plot, which is fine. There's still quite a bit, though, that needs to be clarified on what exactly is going on with Hazen. And Lucian's mom especially, her prophecies, the other Jedi seers, just everything going on in that sphere, everything going on in Lucian's head concerning all the directions he wants to go in for his plans. I'm remembering now that with, like, the redemption of Ulic Qel-Droma and the defeat of Exar Kun, there's not really any Sith around anymore, right? Like, the Jedi are so concerned with defeating the Sith, but there's no Sith around anymore. So, like, I don't know how they think that the Sith lineage is going to continue if all of the known Sith are dead. I know that Freed and Nad and some of the other Sith spirits were able to basically restart the Sith with Ulic and Exar from beyond the grave, like christen them as Sith, and we know that Exar's spirit is still alive to some capacity. You know, maybe that's what they're worried about, but they haven't mentioned Exar in that way. I don't think they've discussed him, like, on the page. It's just, I know that the prophecies are vague and the Jedi Covenant is meant to be flawed, but, like, something doesn't add up here with what their plans and motivations are. And I don't think it's just because we don't have all the information yet. So I'm thinking that Hazen has got to be related to the Sith in some way, right? Like, the way that he's introduced and he's all shadowy and he's talking to Lucian and he's hiding things about his mother and the visions, and he seems to be the one that's pulling Lucian and the Covenant with the strings behind the scenes. And it's like, even just his design alone with the robot parts, and he looks like a villain. I don't know, it just feels like he is the mastermind of some greater evil plan and is using Lucian as a pawn in that plan.
Always in the shadows from the very beginning.
Lucian is a Jedi with Jedi anxieties. He's a severely misguided and at this point pretty evil Jedi, but we know his motivations pretty clearly in that he wants the Jedi and the Republic to persevere, even though he's kind of missing the entire point by wanting to kill a bunch of children and cover it up. Basically, we know why Lucian is doing what he's doing. We don't know what's up with Hazen and Lucian's mother. And considering how mysterious Hazen is and how we already know that he's keeping things from Lucian, I'm putting my bets right now. I'm thinking Lucian is like Palpatine with his version of Anakin. He's manipulating these visions and the spheres that his kind of apprentice-like figure has, and he wants to do all of this to serve some kind of Sith-y diabolical end. And I mean, we know the Sith need to return in the flesh at some point, given that KOTOR happens a few years from now, and just, you know, the prequels where the Sith are there. But, you know, they've been nowhere in sight with these comics, and we still have quite a few comics to go, but it's like they have to come from somewhere. So I'm thinking Hazen hiding in plain sight, but pulling things from the shadows is definitely kind of where this comic could be going, to setting up the future of the Sith. But, you know, the way that these comics go, maybe they'll just introduce something else completely out of left field later. So moving back to Zane, again, I really like everything they do in this volume, just being a really good example of what a Jedi should do, kind of in an environment and a setting where the Jedi as an institution, and even the Jedi that are closest to him, have totally screwed him over and done some pretty bad stuff. You know, he's trying to help the Republic even though the Republic hates him, and even just offering like a small meal to an alien. Great little examples of what Jedi should do, even if we may think Zane is like an unconventional Jedi by maybe prequel era standards. Also, Zane is actually like a pretty skilled and badass Jedi. Like, being able to unscrew a wall panel with the Force to escape, even if, you know, it took a while, that's impressive, and they convey it as an impressive feat in the comics. And I think Zane is a lot more adept at combat and skills and strategizing than the narrative kind of makes him out to be. I'm not too sure what's going on with him in the Vision, where he appeared to his old master Rana, you know, all menacingly. I know, you know, he told them he was on his old revenge mission so far, but Zane has been pretty focused on just staying out of trouble and hiding out with Griff and the others so far in this story. There's this really dark side to Zane that the story keeps telling us is there, but I feel like the more it does, the more we see Zane in actuality in the present just being a really good Jedi and being the one who's like most attuned with the light side of the Force. I don't know, it feels like something that they keep telling us to watch out for that isn't really coming up in any real way. So I'm not sure if the Jedi Covenant is going to be like the final boss for this huge like 10-volume series, or if it's going to be the Sith or something, or even more sinister that's going to reveal itself later. So I wonder to what extent all of his threats to the Jedi Covenant are actually going to come together. But, you know, I guess this is what happens when you make like a half-hour video on every single comic arc. You're going to get a little bit impatient on things that are going to be resolved eventually. So I interpreted the vision as being like the Padawans killing their evil alternate versions of themselves that supposedly would have been evil, but they're basically telling the Jedi that they were wrong to judge them that way. But Wikipedia says that the vision is of the students killing the masters instead, which if that's the case, I don't know why they're like leaving that ambiguous by having these faceless spacesuits, and the spacesuits are only really attributed to the Padawans anyway. I interpreted the vision as like Zane showing the Covenant that they were wrong, but I guess it's just Zane going like, I'm gonna get you, I'm gonna get you. Or maybe this particular Jedi Master is just really sensitive to having these kinds of visions and is just paranoid, and Zane isn't sending her, you know, like magic evil emails through the Force. I don't know, this Force stuff, they can, because of the way the Force works, it's really wibbly wobbly and vague and complicated, but Star Wars rarely leaves things like this up to interpretation forever, at least to this extent. So again, this is just something I'm gonna have to wait to get resolved at a later story point. So moving on to Griff, one thing that I really appreciate how they characterize Griff in this issue is that his greed and his antics are finally catching up to him and putting him in danger. So far his scams have been portrayed as either victimless or like innocuous or useful for getting Zane out of trouble. So even though Griff is like a criminal, he's usually portrayed as a good guy. But in this case he took it a little too far and he put himself at the mercy of the Mandalorian carpet bombing to earn a few extra bucks selling Trandoshan hotcakes. You know, I kind of just thought his character would generally stay the same for a while and just be there to provide some comic relief or a quick and easy escape for Zane that would still be fun to, you know, watch unfold. So I'm very happy to see that he may be written to kind of reconsider his priorities, even if some of that character work like might happen off screen. Again, I'm assuming he's gonna survive this because if, you know, just the way it's written, I can tell that they're not gonna kill off a character like that off page. But you know, how he comes back, how he's gonna change, how he's gonna take all of this into consideration, how that's gonna affect the story, who knows yet. So the art in these arcs is overall pretty great, whether each issue was either published by Brian Ching or Dustin Weaver. The characters are expressive, the colors really pop, and the detail is still really, really nice, especially in certain scenes where there's like a large arrangement of ships or even just like the interior of a room, all very nice to look at. Dustin Weaver did the penciling in the issue with Lucian, and I gotta say, while I prefer Dustin's work with Zane's character, I can't see Lucian as looking anything other than the way that Brian Ching draws him, with like the dark hooded eyes and the wide forehead. It's just too iconic of a look for him, I'm sorry. But before I do finish up, I did want to note that I did recognize and appreciate the inclusion of Cartho Nasi, who is your first companion character in the KOTOR game and overall a very iconic Star Wars EU character. You know, he's just as charming and dependable in the story for Zane as he is in the game for the player character, and it's nice to see. I hope we get more of him in the future, and this isn't the last we see of him in the comics. So that's about all I have to say for Days of Fear and Nights of Anger. Overall, a decent story that maybe doesn't do one or two characters justice in my eyes, but this series is juggling a lot of parts, and this is definitely like a midway chapter, and it's introducing a lot of things and resolving a lot of things all at the same time. Plus, John Jackson Miller, with my experience, is a pretty good writer, so I trust him that in the future all of this will kind of come to an exciting and a satisfying climax. But some middle chapters are more interesting than others, so I'm going to give this one 3.5 out of 5 assassin droids. This isn't the end of the video though, as we have some news organs that are similar to the one Taris Holofeed column that we saw back around issue 0 back in part 19 of this series, and of course all of these are also written by John Jackson Miller. So I didn't find these in like any of my borrowed trade paperbacks or any electronic versions of the single issues I could find online, but the YouTube channel Revanchist has all of these KOTOR articles and news organs and stuff on his YouTube channel. He does like awesome narrated editions with voice acting, it's really good. I referenced him a while back when I first covered that Taris Holofeed, and I'll link him again in the description of this video, as his videos on these were very useful. Technically, in terms of the timeline, it seems that these 6 articles we're covering each take place in between the 6 respective issues, but I decided to include them here at the end of the video just for pacing's sake. You know, I didn't want to break up the story like that. These articles are also supplementary. They're not essential for understanding the story or the lore of the comics, but they add some additional depth to kind of the world and like a grounded but more distanced view of kind of the events of these series. You know, as well as a couple of name draws for characters or groups that I believe will be expanded upon later and I notice are from the KOTOR game. Plus, in the series we are covering literally everything, so it can't really be avoided. So our first one, which is the Jimas Veltraa Memorial Edition of the Admiral's List, which is the official Republic Navy communique channel, we learn of Admiral Jimas Veltraa, who perished during the Republic defense of Taris and whose efforts delayed the Mandalorian siege, which is still ongoing. We also get a brief note on the promotion of Saul Karath to Rear Admiral. The next, which comes from the Adjudicator, which is a publication for freelance security professionals, we can see bounty information on Zane, Griff, Camper's disguised persona, and a serial killer called the Corellian Strangler. We also get a column complaining about how the Mandalorian invasion is making it more difficult for bounty hunters to find their targets, mostly because the legitimate organizations offering the bounties are getting overrun by the Mandalorians. The article ends with an assertion that Mandalorians might make decent bounty hunters if the circumstances were different. The Taris Holofeed Siege Edition gives us some details on the Mandalorian invasion there, and we learn that the Mandalorians are absolutely not backing down, destroying more and more previously untouched areas of the city planet. Loss of life is high, but the article takes the time to mention a lighter moment when a surveillance droid tried to issue a parking citation to a Mandalorian bomb and got obliterated, much to the entertainment of bystanders. We also get a mention of the Jedi group known as the Revanchists, who are Jedi who are directly involved in the war despite the Order as a whole hesitating to respond. The Remember Serroco edition of the Admiral's List details the sudden and cowardly incineration of Serroco by the Mandalorians, stating that there is little hope of finding additional survivors. We also see a brief note from Admiral Karath updating the Republic on his status and commending the efforts of Cartho Nasi. Adascorp's report on Project Black Harvest is a transcript of a conversation between Adaska's grandfather Argalo and Camper's old identity Gorman Van Drake. We see Van Drake explaining the Exogorth's momentous appetite, and though he proposes their uses for intergalactic waste cleanup, Lord Argalo immediately recognizes their use for war and profit. Like in the comic, we get a mention of Master Arca from Tales of the Jedi, who is also an Arcanian, and the planet feels animosity towards the galaxy for the fall of one of their greatest during the Sith War. Our next Taris Holofeed, the Invasion Edition, is a less polished one, as the Holofeed reporters and staff are actively fleeing the invasion. They report on the movements of Mandalorian shock troops and Basilisk war droids throughout the city, led by a Mandalorian warrior named Cassus Fett, as well as the disappearance of the planet's senator, Goravis. They decry the lack of Republic aid and ask just what it is the Mandalorians want and when they're going to stop. The building the reporters are in gets swarmed by Mandalorians, and the transmission comes to an end. And that does it for part 21 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review series. I'm really excited to speed right on through to the next few issues, as I really want to know where this whole story is headed, so I hope you're looking forward to part 22, and until next time, may the Force be with you, always.